Welcome, everybody. My name is Calvin Winner. I'm the director at Gainsborough's House, and it's wonderful to see you all, and it's a great privilege and an honour for me to introduce today's speaker, Ian Griffiths, creative director of Max Mara. I'll say a few words about Ian, and then we'll get going. Ian, what a tour de force. You've been with Max Mara now since, I believe, 1987, and still going extremely strong, and I think you've described it as the shortest CV in history. But where else could you possibly go? What a place to be. You've been a creative tour de force there for all of that time. And just to say a little bit about your background before Max Mara, you originally were from Manchester. You studied at Manchester, architecture first, then moved into fashion. And then you went on to the RCA, encouraged by the great Ozzie Clarke. And it was during your time at the RCA, as I understand it, there was a competition for Max Mara, student competition, that you won, and indeed they went on to hire you. And there it was, 1987, after graduation, you start at Max Mara. I think for me, what was so impressive about you is the way that your sort of research-based practice manifests itself. And many of you will know much more about Ian's work and Max Mara than I do. But just to pick one example, the recent collection you did inspired by the Brontes and the Yorkshire Moors, absolutely phenomenal. And I, for one, am looking for some inspiration from the 18th century and possibly Thomas Gainsborough. But that's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. But it's wonderful to have you here. And I know everybody is really thrilled to have you here and looking forward to your talk. And over to you, Ian. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Calvin. Thank you, everyone. It's an honour to be here. And as you pointed out, I've been at Max Mara for a very long time. And some of the things I produced in the early days are now themselves as old nearly as Gainsborough's. Although people are still wearing them. I will reiterate, I'm not an art historian, I'm a fashion designer. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is my personal relationship as a fashion designer with Gainsborough and the art of the 18th century and the 18th century itself, which, when we reflect upon it, how many centuries are there that we regard as being an entity, a thing? I mean, you don't talk about the 16th century in the same way as you talk about the 18th century. Perhaps the two entities would be the 14th century, early Renaissance, and the 18th century, which you can regard as being a period, the start and a finish, a thing, an entity in itself. And my first proper look at that period.
I'm so sorry to
Oh, I have got my
mic on. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you
You
very
heard
much.
that, didn't you?
Yes.
I need to repeat it. I have got a loud voice. Well, that makes it much easier. So my first look at the 18th century, like most people, was at school. In my case, O-levels, if anyone can remember what they were. And where the 18th century was presented without irony as the Age of Enlightenment. I learned about Rousseau, Diderot, Montesquieu, the rights of man, the steady build-up towards the French Revolution, and the inexorable path towards equality and democracy. It seemed that the 18th century was all about light and lightness. And as for the art of the 18th century, I visited as a child, a young man, Kenwood House, the Wallace Collection, the Courtauld. This place didn't exist then. And the big London museums. I visited them all at various times during my growing up. But of course, the thing to remember about those days was that there was no internet. So when you saw something, it stayed with you or it didn't. You couldn't check on it afterwards. You couldn't just summon it up on your phone. You'd have to go to a library to find an image. It seems hard to imagine what that would have been like. But it also meant that when you started work on a project of any description, you were unable to instantly check on your research. So looking back, it's hard to see sometimes precisely where your inspiration came from and what you were thinking of at the time. Anyway, in 1977, I was a young man in thrall to punk rock. There I am. Punk rock with its delight in the darker side of things. But at the same time, I was already a little bored with the standard punk uniform of ripped up T-shirts and safety pins and bondage trousers. I was looking for something else, a style. And in 1978, I was exposed to two very different visions of the 18th century than those that I'd been exposed to in my A-level history, two much darker visions. The first, I don't know if anyone remembers, was Jonathan Miller's excellent TV series, The Body in Question. Does anyone remember that? It was of such quality. It was a pioneering series, if you remember. It was presented as a kind of docudrama with Jonathan Miller talking to camera and then scenes, vignette, played out with actors, directed by him, and designed to recreate the spirit of the mood of a particular moment in history. And episode 8 dealt with Dr. Mesmer, a fashionable figure in 18th century Paris, a sort of hypnotist whose seances were the hot ticket. He held them in Place Vendôme, and in the 1770s and 1780s, he really was the man to go to, and he claimed to heal his wealthy clientele through the power of animal magnetism. And this is a clip from Jonathan Miller's Body in Question, talking...
Water. Entrancing music, drawn curtains, and the master himself stalking the darkened salon in a long embroidered robe all help to charge this charismatic atmosphere.
I'll stop it there. I was mesmerized by Miller's portrayal of the opposite of the Enlightenment, the dark magic, this theatrically rigged falseness, grotesque costumes and wigs, the flaking makeup, barely concealing pox-ridden, addled faces, the affected mannerisms, the descent into delirium and chaos, anything but enlightened. And I was fascinated by it. And the second thing that I was exposed to was Candide by Voltaire, which I read in French. This was published in 1759 as a complete rebuttal of the philosophy of optimism. Famous quote, "All is for the best, in this the best of all possible worlds." That so insisted the philosopher in the book, Pangloss. And yet the book's protagonists, Candide and Cunégonde, the lovers, face every kind of horror imaginable: cruelty, injustice, degradation, the theatre of war, mutilation, deceit, betrayal, brutal slaughter, and slavery. When the lovers, Candide and Cunégonde, are finally reunited, as you probably know, to cultivate their garden, they're old and broken and disease-ridden. But Voltaire says that to cultivate one's own garden is the best one can hope for in this cruel, mean world. So this, I was looking for some kind of expression for this this vision of the 18th century, and desperate to live out this kind of decadent, exotic style. And then suddenly as if in answer to my prayer, the 18th century, in the 1980s, early 80s, 1981, suddenly became fashionable. In Manchester, London, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, the major cities, kids who hung out in clubs, like me, club kids, night after night, turned out dressed in extravagant costumes, posing and pouting like peacocks in these nightclubs, clubs like Blitz in London, which perhaps some of you went to, or Pips in Manchester. In truth, maybe there were a few hundred of us in each town, and there was no Instagram in those days, so the costumes and the looks that we wore were principally for each other. And strange, though, that people are still talking about those days 50 years later and still writing about them. Oh, here we are. Here's an article from Vogue, written by Laird Sorelli Person in 2021, talking about Manchester, the days of the clubs, club culture, and my part in that. There I am. It says 1980. That was 1981. It was a brilliant year, in which, as I say, the 18th century suddenly became the fashion, for us at least. Here are clubbers in London at the Blitz Club, and you can clearly see already 18th century influences. The hair, the bleached hair looking like a wig, the ruffled collar, the girl in the foreground with a 18th century looking bodice here in the central slide, knickerbockers and knee-length stockings, a Spencer jacket with rows of gold buttons, and an elaborate shirt with lace frills at the collar and the cuffs, and a great deal of glamour. The most popular looks were the pirate look, here by Vivienne Westwood, and I've just contrasted that with Thomas Gainsborough's self-portrait, and you can see already the influence the 18th century had at that time on fashion. And the other look, which was very popular at the time, was the so-called dandy highwayman look, championed by the beautiful Adam Ant. And these looks of his, I don't know if I'm pressing the wrong button or I'm pressing the wrong button. Very much inspired by the 18th century. And here on the right, a look by Vivienne Westwood, who of course was one of the most protagonist established designers at that time. And then promoting that fashion, there were also other bands like Bow Wow Wow. This is Bow Wow Wow's Annabella Lwin and Spandau Ballet, who started out good. They got bad very quickly. But they promoted this 18th century look, which became known as the New Romantic look. It was a epithet that we despised and hated, but it was the one that stuck. And then here's me in 1981, alongside, this is rather audacious of me, this is a portrait of me by Kevin Cummings, the well-known portrait photographer who photographed, well, he's most famous for photographing Joy Division, but he also photographed Bowie and just about any band you could mention. So his portrait of me alongside Gainsborough's Morning Walk. There you go. And the photograph of me might also be called The Morning Walk, because this was the outfit that I was wearing when I turned up at his studio for the shoot that he'd asked me to come to for The Face magazine, you know, The Face magazine. That's how I arrived at the studio. That was my look for my morning walk. And you can see there are distinct references and links between what I'm wearing and the portrait, not making a distinction between what he's wearing and what she's wearing. The couple, of course, is Mr. and Mrs. Haley, who are a fashionable couple of the 1780s. We were quite democratic in our approach to what was masculine and what was feminine. We mixed everything together in a way which resulted in quite an androgynous look. But it was most definitely inspired by the fashion of the 18th century, if not specifically the fashion of Gainsborough. And as I say, that was my morning walk. And then to continue, this was me in a large hat, a very large hat, which was inspired by the woman who wore the largest hats of all, the Duchess of Devonshire, painted by Gainsborough. She was noted she was a powerful woman politically and culturally. Again, audacious of me to put myself on the same screen as her. Her hat was made by a fashionable London milliner. Mine was made from coat hangers woven together with a piece of lining material stretched over. It just about stood up for one night clubbing. It had fallen to pieces. The whole outfit had fallen to pieces by the end of the evening. And getting on the bus was a real experience, because I had to get on the bus sideways because my shoulders wouldn't fit through and the hat wouldn't fit through. But on the bus I got, and I can honestly say that this idea of the hat was inspired by that portrait, because I grew up in Derbyshire and I frequently visited Chatsworth as a tourist, not as a guest at tea or anything. And I can remember seeing this portrait at the top of the grand staircase. So to continue and to show you the parallels between the fashion of the fashions of the 18th century, this is a detail from the portrait of Lady Bristol, which is downstairs in the exhibition. This is a detail from Angelica Kauffman's Zeuxis seeking models for his painting of Helen of Troy. It's all about drapery. And finally, here am I wearing a draped gown, which I ran together in 30 minutes, having spent the whole of the afternoon doing my hair and makeup. That was the priority. Where I really felt this idea of draping bits of fabric around you in a neoclassical style. It was very easy and easy to achieve with nothing more at your disposal than an old curtain or a piece of lining material, which is what we had. I mean, we were doing this on supplementary benefit, which at the time was £37.50 per week. And very happily too. The life of a club kid was a very, very happy one. Self-portrait with flowers by Angelica Kauffman again, which is a detail from her painting of Telemachus and the nymphs of Calypso. She often painted herself with garlands of flowers, and so did I. It was springtime, and even though I was living in grey, derelict Manchester, it was springtime, and I felt too this desire for the world of classical mythology, for the god Pan, for Arcadia. And I wasn't yearning for something I didn't have. For me, Manchester and the crepuscular world of the nightclubs was Arcadia. And here I am. I said I made my own clothes in 30 minutes. In that instance, I don't think I was even wearing any. It was just all about the hair and And then here I am again, reflecting Boucher's Daphnis and Chloe. I mean, if I hadn't seen that portrait, or if the photographer who took the picture, who was a really nice lady who worked for the BBC, I never heard from her again. She never became a noted photographer. I never saw any of her work after this shoot that she did at my flat one Sunday afternoon. But was I thinking of Daphnis and Chloe, or was she thinking of Daphnis and Chloe? We were most definitely thinking about something in that world. I mean, and how far away could we possibly be? You know, run-down, derelict Manchester in the 1980s, and the 18th century, the world of dukes and duchesses and archdukes. But just to show you another parallel, here I am in another look, all from 1981. The aim was to do a different look every week, and here is from the exhibition downstairs, John Hopner's Jordan as Viola in Twelfth Night. I mean, it's striking, the similarity in the costume, but also even the attitude of the hand seems to echo so closely the portrait. Of course, a picture like that I would have seen at Kenwood, and of course we were fascinated by the idea of cross-dressing. These were the early days of so-called gender bending, when we played with gender identity and androgynous, enigmatic looks that were difficult to decipher as being masculine or feminine. So something like Twelfth Night would have been already a theme which would have interested and fascinated us. But I also looked at the more masculine world, and here you have, again from the exhibition downstairs, William Pitt the Younger, looking very smart in his black jacket and his white shirt with a red curtain. And here am I in my answer to his look, where the white shirt has been replaced by a white face, and the red curtain is replaced by a red stool, but the black tailored jacket, which I made myself, is there. And there's definitely a reference to the world of the 18th century. And in the heaviness of the makeup, of course, the influence of that film of Jonathan Miller's, which has been a lifelong influence. To move on. So wigs. I never wore a wig. That would have been tipping into costume, moving from fashion into costume. We were always very careful. What we were doing was never trying to reenact a historic moment. It was about a contemporary look. We were expressing something that was inspired by another time, but not intended to recreate it. But I used to change my hairstyle every week, and here we are. And without resorting to wearing a wig, went to some considerable lengths to achieve a dramatic look. I even dyed my hair grey, how many 18-year-old boys today would dye their hair grey in imitation of a portrait like the one of Mrs. Thomas Graham? Here she is in the middle. I think I'm pressing the wrong... Oh, there we go. There she is in the middle. I was fascinated by all the things that women wore in their hair. And there were those fantastic engravings of women with the whole galleons in their hair, and the towering wigs infested with vermin, catching fire when women walked underneath a candelabrum with the candles lit. It fascinated me, and here I am again wearing some kind of veil contraption, again in sort of imitation of the headgear that you find in Gainsborough's portraits. So this is one of the first outfits I ever made to go clubbing. I had no training in dressmaking or sewing. I didn't know how to make a paper pattern. I simply made it up as I went along. Why did I choose to make a knickerbocker suit in blue satin? Why, oh why? It can only have been because of the influence of Blue Boy. And if I didn't make that connection, Kevin Cummings, who took these photographs, most certainly did when he photographed me in a very, very similar pose. And I find the connection between my look and the look of Blue Boy really quite uncanny, and it inspires me again today. Blue Boy obviously is an iconic image, which has had various meanings at various times, has been adopted as a symbol of gay pride, assumed cultural value that Gainsborough couldn't possibly have expected it to have acquired, becoming a symbol of fragile male beauty, gender fluidity, because so many women on stage wore a Blue Boy outfit. Oscar Wilde frequently wore Blue Boy. Oscar Wilde, there we are. Frequently wore clothes that were inspired by Blue Boy, which were the height of fashion until his own downfall. And after his conviction for gross indecency, photographs like this of Oscar Wilde were published in so-called medical books, instructing people how to spot the signs of homosexuality. Cecil Beaton, another of my personal heroes, designed this Blue Boy outfit for a review in the 1950s, which had distinct gay sub-messages. And of course, Quentin Crisp wore the Blue Boy look all his life, at great risk to his personal safety, because anyone who's seen or read his autobiography, The Naked Civil Servant, or seen the film would know that he more than once was beaten up because of his appearance. So that portrait, so significant that after its removal to America to become, by the Huntington family to become part of the Huntington collection, became in the UK a symbol for a lost generation of young men, but at the same time in America was regarded in a different moment as being the epitome of the so-called lavender scare, the lavender scare, where in the USA, features of the Blue Boy look were associated with homosexuality, and again, features such as lace cuffs and fancy shoes were held up as tokens of the homosexual enemy within. So a portrait which has had such huge influence and power, and one which clearly I was aware of, and following in Quentin Crisp's footsteps, I was quite happy to endure the insults that I received when I wore my Blue Boy outfit on the way to Pips in 1981. So that was 1981, and then the brilliant John Galliano. This is his final collection from Central St Martin's. As you know, in British art schools and the fashion courses, the students at the end of their course produce a collection, and John Galliano's collection received great critical acclaim, and it was inspired by the French Revolution. So this was 1984. But the new romantic, so-called new romantic moment was kind of over. This is Princess Diana, and she was, bless her, she was the kiss of death, as far as we were concerned, because she was an early adapter of most fashions, and here you can see her wearing black velvet knickerbockers and a sort of pie-crust frill shirt. When Princess Diana wore a look, we stopped, because you knew that the following week it would be in Miss Selfridge or Chelsea Girl, and in fact, by 1982, the new romantic look was kind of everywhere. Everyone was wearing it. It had become devalued, and we moved on to other things. Although John Galliano continued, and so did Vivienne Westwood, continued all her life to make a study of the 18th century in the most serious kind of way. She revered the Wallace collection, and she described it as a jewel box of treasures. And she said it was the greatest art school in the country. Her favourites were the Fragonards and the Bouchers. And here is Linda Evangelista wearing a dress inspired by a Watteau portrait. And here is one of her famous and highly sought-after corsets, printed with an image of Boucher's Daphne and Chloe on the front. And Galliano also has continued throughout his career to reference the 18th century, both, here we are. This is all from the Dior Couture 2007-2008 collection. You can see here the dress, which is very similar to the one Madame Pompadour is wearing in the portrait by Boucher, and the hat, which could be inspired by Gainsborough's Morning Walk, again from the same collection. Almost certainly this dress is inspired by the Countess of Howe, which is downstairs in the exhibition. And moving on, most definitely, Fragonard's swing must have been the inspiration for this look, although it was never declared. I mean, look at the hat, look at the dress, look at the attitude. So for Galliano, the 18th century is a theme which has run through, just as with Vivienne Westwood, run right through his career. But I, by this time, had moved on. There's the hat. Had moved on. One final one, Madame Pompadour. I had moved on to modernity, and I was thinking about modern clothes for modern women as a project. Just some images, just to help you understand what I moved from those Club Kid days. It was all about design and modernity, and as my career developed, I continued to visit fashion schools. Wherever I went in the world, I always make a habit of seeking out whichever fashion school exists nearby and going there to give a lecture or a talk or a seminar with the students, as much as anything to understand what's inspiring them, what they're looking at. And I noticed that the 18th century had disappeared from their inspiration. It became most unusual to find anyone who was inspired by anything from the 18th century. And the reason for that, I guess, is that the 18th century was now associated with those values of cruelty, injustice, colonialism, deprivation, social inequality, and the evils of slavery. It was regarded as toxic. And here is just a reminder of that moment at the height of of ill feeling about the 18th century. Quite rightly, I mean, people who see a statue every day that reminds them of injustices in the recent past, not within living memory, but within a few generations, quite rightly wanted to destroy relics from the period that they regarded as being brutal. But since those days, there have been various developments which have detoxified the 18th century. And one of them was the Royal Academy's excellent exhibition, Entangled Past, 1729 to the present. And the exhibition reflected on the Academy's role in establishing a canon of Western art history within the context of colonialism, empire and enslavement. It was an honest look in the mirror. And one of the most striking things about that collection was in the first room to see portraits hanging like this, looking like, in every respect, conventional 18th century portraits showing 18th century dress and finery, painted in oils with fine frames, but the faces are black. And one realizes the shock of that strikes one, and it is such an eloquent expression of the injustice and the inequality that existed within the art establishment. So these two pictures are of Francis Barber, the slave on the left, the Francis Barber who became the friend and the heir of Samuel Johnson, by Joshua Reynolds. And the man on the right is an unknown man, painted by an unknown painter. But the third portrait in that room was of this man, Charles Ignatius Sancho, who was one of the first black men to vote in a British general election, a man of letters, a critic, a composer, a shopkeeper, and a campaigner for abolition. He counted amongst his friends not only Gainsborough, who painted this portrait, but Hogarth, Handel, David Garrick, and the King himself. And if you're not familiar with it, it's worth reading The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho, which is a novel based on his life by Patterson Joseph. Well worth reading. Black faces had appeared in art before in the West, but usually as anonymous slaves or servants. And in this portrait, Gainsborough paints Sancho directly and sympathetically, with a sympathy that you don't see in some of the portraits he painted of his wealthy patrons. Apparently, he painted this in 2 hours during a visit by Sancho, who was accompanying his employer, who was the Duchess of Montagu. And there's a feeling of this painting of two people, the painter and the sitter, who are both reliant on wealthy patrons. There's a feeling of mutuality between Gainsborough and his sitter, Sancho, that you don't find in all his pictures. And here is Lawrence Sterne on the right, who was another correspondent and friend of Sancho. And in one of his many letters to Sancho, he wrote, "It is by the finest tints and most insensible gradations that nature descends from the fairest face at St. James to the sootiest complexion in Africa. At which tint of these is it that the ties of blood are to cease? And how many shades must we descend lower still in the scale before mercy is to vanish with them? But this is not an uncommon thing, my good Sancho, for one half of the world to use the other half. So this is not an uncommon thing, my dear Sancho, for one half of the world to use the other half like brutes and then endeavour to make them so." So there was a real sympathy between Lawrence Sterne and this man. showing us that the 18th century was the era of slavery, but it was also the era in which the movement to abolish slavery began. And I was also influenced by work by artists like this one, Cara Walker, in the exhibition with which the Whitney inaugurated its downtown location in New York. The exhibition was entitled America is Hard to See, and it featured work that challenged the orthodoxies of American culture, orthodoxies that are so ingrained as to seem invisible. So Walker here uses the very reassuringly familiar bourgeois medium of the cut paper silhouette, but uses it to depict acts of really savage violence from the age of slavery and afterwards. And work such as this kind of lanced the boil, metaphorically, and somehow the 18th century started to feel like a safe place to look once more. So I started to think about the 18th century as a time when the foundations for the abolition of slavery and justice were laid. And in 2022, I started to feel that I had to design a collection that was inspired by the 18th century, but with the modernity that you'd expect from Max Mara. I wanted to avoid anything which could feel even remotely costumey. So casting round for a story or a muse on which to hang my collection, I came across the figure of Emily de Châtelet, who was, it's sad to say, the first thing we say about her is that she was Voltaire's lover. But in actual fact, the whole point about her is that she was an eminent philosopher and a brilliant scientist and mathematician and philosopher in her own right. And her work is still consulted. The most famous portrait of her is by a woman, unfortunately not Angelica Kauffman, but Marianne Loire. But in this portrait, we see a highly successful, brilliant woman painted by another woman. So it gives us an idea that in the 18th century, women could have a really powerful voice in the intellectual and creative culture of the day, provided, of course, they were born into the right circles. And she proved to be a great muse for the collection. And after a great deal of reading and research, here's my mood board for that collection. A horrible word, but mood board for me is just a summary of all the influences that go into a collection. So you can see I used the video of Jonathan Miller, Candide, Voltaire, Nancy Mitford's Voltaire in Love, a bust of Voltaire, various items from the male and female wardrobe of the 18th century, and some references, other references to the 1980s. And I'll read you, if I may. How are we doing for time, by the way? Oh, okay. I'll read you the press release for this show, which kind of explains how I approached it. I said that the 18th century was kaleidoscopic, as vibrant and eventful as the present age, and made a parallel between the coffee houses then and the internet now, both conduits for disseminating news and ideas, both real and fake, at lightning speed. Emily, the Marquise de Châtelet, free-thinking, free-spirited, a woman whose philosophical magnum opus was hailed as a major contribution to the Enlightenment, set the tone for rational thinking in 18th century France. With a pen as sharp as a surgeon's blade, she dissected the issues of the age, the education, the social role of women, the afterlife, these are all things that she wrote about, and the nature of human happiness. To be happy, she said, one must rid oneself of prejudice, she said. She lived in the cavernous Baroque gloom of the Château de Cirey with Voltaire, the man described as Europe's first truly modern celebrity, and together, bound together with a sense of magic, the pair spent their days in intellectual debate and scientific experiment. And she lived in that brief period when a woman could have a voice, provided she had the means to educate herself. And then I, in the press release, talk about the Age of Reason, which paved the path to modernity, and yet the fashion of the Age of Reason belonged to a darker time. Voluminous drapery, frills and furbelows, feathers, horsehair, hoops, whalebone, lead face paint, powder, rouge, and towering verminous wigs. Although she was one of that group of intellectuals whose originality of thought shone a light on the secrets of the universe, Emily dressed in much the same way as any other woman at court. But in Max Mara's imagination, my imagination, Emily spurns the convoluted and restrictive styles of the day, and natural science lifts the curtain on the future and reveals a wardrobe for the now. I also noted that often Emily dressed as a man. For one thing, it was the only way she could get into those coffee houses where she could exchange ideas with the mathematicians of the day. So from the neat notary to the swashbuckling cavalier, the show featured a full panorama of calibrated characters. And fast forward 300 years, and we discover in Max Mara Emily's contemporary alter ego looking down the other end of the telescope, looking at us, where reason has made a headway, but what we're missing now is romance, which she had in ample quantities. And from that, I'll just talk you quickly through how we developed all that into a collection. I work principally with sketches and series of sketches. This is just a selection. The first thing that I took was the idea of the Watteau back, so-called, the sack back, which is a very a distinctive feature of 18th century dress. But I grafted it onto the place where you'd least expect it, onto a military coat, onto a short camel masculine coat, onto a parka, or onto a collarless coat. Or the idea of, or onto, there we have it on the Watteau back, on the back of a suit, which is in elaborate silk brocade, but has a distinct modernity about it. And then here, I was playing with the idea of the banyan coat, which was a masculine item from the male wardrobe, a slightly flared, voluminous coat that men wore en déshabillé, so when they were at home. Here's the Max Mara version in camel, reversible with brocade, or a version more like an overcoat with a military feel, or with the idea of a quilted lining that you could reverse. Or in our iconic teddy bear fabric, it grew a hood and became the banyan coat, which ended up opening the show. So this is how I was playing with ideas for the 18th century, and then taking forward this idea of quilting into the coat, again the banyan coat, with this leather detailing, like coats of the time. The Max Mara iconic Madame coat, reinterpreted with quilting, inside or outside or reversible, and then a bomber jacket. I wanted to think of things that Emily de Châtelet would never have had, but I could imagine her wearing, and I can't do a show without a bomber jacket. So for me, it's the ultimate symbol of modernity, and even taking that quilted fabric into the idea of a skirt with a panier detail, which is an idea that I played with later, or one-shouldered. I was thinking of portraits that you see of Grand Dukes and Cardinals or hussars with their jackets thrown casually over one shoulder, and we developed a whole series of coats and pieces like this, where the coat has a leather strap on the inside, which enables you to wear it over your shoulder in a sort of cavalier hussar way. So something between the portrait of a cardinal and a hussar. A black velvet coat from the Max Mara archive from the 18th century with this extraordinary embroidered frogging gave rise to various iterations, here as a banyan coat, used as a decorative. And then here is a bomber jacket to take something so ornate and 18th century, but to apply it to something so contemporary, like a bomber jacket, or used simply on a dress, or a dress with only one sleeve, a one-shouldered dress. Here I was trying to find ways of developing a panier skirt, which could be modern, without recreating the skirts of the 18th century. And in this instance, it's about patch pockets at the hip, which provide volume, either on longer or shorter skirts, a sort of half a jacket grafted onto the waistband of a straight skirt, or fins that extend at the hips at the side. Or in the end, the solution that I hit upon was a fairly straight skirt, but at the top it widens and has darts which throw fullness into the area around the hips. So it creates a sort of hippie pannier feel, but the skirt is still a pencil skirt. Some things you can't make work. I think Princess Diana just killed knickerbockers off forever. I just couldn't make them work. And I tried various ways, and none of them worked. I hit upon wide trousers, which were so un-18th century, but with this idea of a dart at the knee that threw fullness into them. And the same detail we repeated for shirts and blouses. But yes, Princess Diana. The corset. I wanted to avoid lacing corsets because it seemed too obvious. So I developed the idea of these corsets which wrap and fasten with a buckle, which seemed to be so much more modern. Because of course I was so anxious to avoid anything which felt even slightly costumey. Although I loved these necklines, like the neckline of Vivienne Westwood's Boucher corset, and the parka. Again, like the bomber jacket, it's the furthest thing from the 18th century you could imagine. But imagine it executed in a rich brocade or an elaborate silk fabric, a precious woven damask or jacquard, and then from the parka, to go back to the idea of the pannier skirt, to cut the parka off and gather it in at the top. So it creates this volume at the hip, becomes a sort of entirely new take on the pannier skirt with complete modernity, I hoped. There you go with the quilted version. It's always about design process, it's always about circling back. And then at the end, coming back to the idea of the Watteau back, the sack back, but on a modern dress, which could be short and princess length, or the dress itself could be short with quite a dramatic train, or it could become a long dress, but always with an eye to modernity. And the thing that, of course, makes it work otherwise is the shoes, and that's what, because it changes the look completely. I'll just show you a clip from the film, so you can, the video of that collection, so you can see how that interpretation. So there's that coat, the banyan coat. There's that coat with the sack back in the jacquard fabric. The corsets, we ultimately realised in patent leather, but they don't lace, they have a buckle. Here's the one-shouldered coats. Of course, they're normal coats, but they just have this feature on the inside that enable you to wear them asymmetrically. And of course, to make the whole thing work, the shoes just had to be big, chunky, punky boots. Nothing delicate or 18th century about those. The feeling I wanted to express in the show was one of complete dignity. So that was that show. And since then, that was several years ago, my work's continued. Just last month, I was invited to join a panel near to here at Norwich University of the Arts, assessing the work of final year students. And I was very pleased to note that a number of students had produced work which was inspired by the 18th century. Among them, India Farmer, who was clearly inspired by that period. Here we are, here's her work. I was so pleased to see the return of the 18th century as a source of inspiration. And I asked her about it, and she said, I drew inspiration from the 18th century aesthetic, particularly corsets, undergarments, and pocket hoops, those are those panier things, because of the way they visually represent control, restriction, and social expectation. So she takes a very eyes wide open to the eyes wide open approach to her source of inspiration, and perhaps one can expect this high degree of awareness in contemporary fashion designers, because our understanding of fashion now is a great deal more profound and more nuanced than it was in 1981. And fashion designers, long derided as intellectual no-marks, are finally expected now to articulate the complex thinking behind their own work, rather than wait for it to be decoded by suitably qualified academics, art historians, sociologists, and semioticians. And where once fashion was thought to be about pretty things, we now know otherwise. Writers like Rebecca Arnold, if you want to check her out, and Caroline Davis have demonstrated that fashion is as much about societal anxieties and fears as it is about desires. Although instinctively, I felt that back in the 80s when I was haunted by the sinister beauty of Jonathan Miller's film and the macabre humour of Voltaire's Candide. But just as these frothy costumes we wore in the 80s concealed a darker mood, so the world of Rococo itself is not the Elysian ideal that it would seem. Jonathan Jones wrote in The Guardian, and this is the key to my understanding of the Rococo. Rococo was the last style of traditional courtly art, but more and more, as you look at it, it was the first modern art. Rococo's imaginary parkland is socially ambiguous. The people parading in fine dresses might be ladies, or they might be prostitutes. The harlequins courting them might be lords, or they might be servants. In London, master balls, the pleasure gardens of Vauxhall and St. James were Rococo social spaces where money could wash away class identity, where the aristocracy mingled with scum. I love this feeling of the underclass. And Boucher himself, whose paintings on the surface are sometimes so hard to look at because they're so sugary, you have to understand he lived in the world of theatre. And those heavenly landscapes of his paintings, the skyscapes, are cleverly lit stage sets. The goddesses and the nymphs and the queens are actresses or even prostitutes. Diderot condemned all of that as morally corrupt and deceptive. But to me, an unemployed youth living in Manchester at the time of a very cruel Thatcher government, where there seemed to be no future for my talents or those around me, that illusory world of Boucher was what attracted me, the falseness of it. And I connected with the twilight demi-monde in a way that I could never have connected with the world of the Grand Dukes and the Cardinals and the Emperors. And Thomas Gainsborough himself, often dismissed as a flatterer of the elite, would probably have felt the same way, I think. His often near contempt for some of his wealthy patrons lies just below the surface of the paint. And on the other hand, his portraits of those that he loved or admired, the humble people in society with whom he felt empathy, shine through. His portrait of a ruined royal mistress, Mary Robinson, which I don't have a reproduction of, unfortunately. His portrait of his own daughters and aspiring singers show an empathy. And again, Jonathan Jones says, sexuality, class, poverty, politics, Gainsborough's work encompassed the lot, brushing as close to the bone as he might dare. And Jones described Georgian Britain as an effervescent, commercial, cynical, corrupt, celebrity-conscious, shallow, competitive, socially mobile and dangerous place. There was most definitely a parallel between that world and the world that I grew up in the 1980s. And I leave it to you to consider whether there's a parallel with that world and the world today. Suffice to say that I anticipate a flurry of interest in the 18th century over the coming years and seasons, and have no doubt that some of the works in this exhibition will be referenced on the catwalks. I don't normally tell people what I'm working on until a few days before a show, but I will say, in answer to Calvin's comments earlier in his introduction, that this is my mood board for the next collection that we will be showing in Milan in September of this year for summer 2026. And as you can see, it's all about the Rococo. There's Gainsborough's Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, The Morning Walk, Princess Elizabeth, as she was then, photographed by Cecil Beaton in a Rococo setting. I think the background is actually a Fragonard. And the table settings from the dinner that I recently gave for the executive chairman of the Gainsborough's house, Calvin, at my home in Italy. You can see the floral arrangements there. Everything comes together with images of David Bowie, who's rarely missing from my mood boards, but always serves as a reminder of how the historical, in his Harlequin costume, how this historical can become modern. So that is what I'm working on currently. And that is the story of my personal relationship with the 18th century. And it's fascinating, enigmatic, moody and mysterious, but to me, never dry or dusty. Thank you. Thank you. I hope I didn't take too long.
Wow. Ian, thank you so much. Folks, you heard it here first. Sneak preview into the future. Ian, thank you so much. What a wonderful journey you've taken us on. An incredible insight into your creative process. It's been absolutely amazing. I'm constantly fascinated in the way that art permeates everyday society, and I can't think of a better example, actually, than fashion and the way that your creative process does that. So thank you so much. It's been wonderful. I think we still have time maybe for some questions for Ian. So if anybody has a question, now is the time. Yes, we have a question over here.
lovely to see the picture we have of Voltaire's mistress. She did feature in an exhibition on Versailles at the Science Museum recently. I don't know if you remember.
I didn't see it.
And it had the other portrait of her with her book
Yeah.
in front of her. And she's particularly famous for translating Newton
And she corrected the mistakes in the yeah.
from Latin to French.
Yeah.
And nobody else could understand it.
No, and she actually improved on it. She noticed mistakes that Newton hadn't noticed and that Voltaire didn't notice. She corrected Voltaire's work too. I mean, I think this says something about, powerful women. She was so powerful that she could do that kind of thing anonymously.
But very sadly, she died quite young in childbirth.
She did.
And it's really sad to think that, life was precarious for everybody in those
Yes.
days, but particularly for women, I think.
It was, and she died quite young, but her translations are still in use today.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
It was really fantastic. I loved every second of it. But I wondered how you made the great leap from the Manchester nightclub to Max Mara.
Well,
It does seem, we've kind of missed that bit.
There's a whole lecture there.
Just a quick, very quick.
Very quickly, the Falklands War. I'd been at a party all night. I was lying on the sofa of some scuzzy flat in Wythenshawe, which was even rougher than Hume, and it came on the breakfast television that Margaret Thatcher was thinking of introducing conscription for unemployed youths. And I thought, that's me. I thought, I am not going to go fight in the Falklands. I better go back to college. Went back to college, where I had the great fortune to be taught by Ozzie Clarke, who encouraged me to go to the Royal College. And the first project that I had at the Royal College was for Max Mara, which I'd never heard of. And Max Mara offered me a job. So that, in a nutshell, was how I made that jump from one thing to another.
Wasn't there a story of the pen?
Oh, we had to do this competition, and we had to colour the sketches in to submit them to Italy. And most of my looks were black. And so I was colouring in black felt pen. It was the night before. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was exhausted. And I was thinking, I'm so tired. I want to go to bed. I'm not going to win this thing anyway, so what's the point? But my flatmate came home. She was a clubber too, and she'd been to Ascension or Taboo or something like that. And I said, Trish, you wouldn't have a black marker pen in your bag, would you? And she said, yes, I have. I was like, well, why have you got a marker pen in your bag? But I was kind of slightly annoyed because it meant that I had to stay up all night and finish these sketches off. And I cut them out and stuck them onto, I don't know if you remember, we used to buy these plastic sheets. They used to have a piece of black paper inside that you were supposed to throw away. But I had to use a piece of black paper to mount these tatty sketches onto. And we still have them in the archive. And I won the competition. Miraculously. But for years, every morning when I went to work at Max Mara, I was expecting him to say, sorry, mate, we got the wrong guy.
You're renowned for the wonderful camel coat. Where did that fantastic fabric come from? Because it is something else. It just ripples.
It's from camels. Camels become, of course, the camel comes from the masculine world, and the camel coat was an articulation of male power, dominance, prestige. Max Mara was quite revolutionary in giving that to women, and now we are the world's largest consumer of camel's hair. By the way, when we talk about camel's hair, it's not. It's brushed from the camel. It's not. No camels are harmed in the making of camel's hair. And now Max Mara is the irony is that I now see all around the world men wearing Max Mara camel coats. So it's gone full circle, and Max Mara now owns the camel coat. It's ours. And if you wear one, you feel powerful. You feel smart, yeah.
Ian, thank you so much. I think we're probably out of time. But,
Thank you. No, thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.